Hey everyone, and welcome to Private Podcast, where we plug in and explore the intersection of privacy, human rights, technology, and democracy. I'm your host, Derek Silva. Today we are speaking with Brittany Piovesan. Brittany is a program officer at Internet Society Foundation. As the program officer, she is responsible for implementing and managing the chapter Beyond the Net and strengthening communities and improving lives and livelihoods, SLILLS. That's the skills funding programs. It's a heck of an acronym. Prior to joining the foundation, Brittany worked as senior program officer with Internew's global technology team. She has an undergraduate degree in history and women's studies from the University of Ottawa, and a graduate degree in Islamic history and civilizations from the University of Chicago. Love Chicago. Brittany, thanks for taking the time to be here today on Private Podcast.
Awesome, excited to be here.
Good. So let's get straight into it. Tell us about the Internet Society Foundation. What's it all about?
So first, I would say that we are very new as a foundation. We only started work in July of 2019, so just under 2 years old. But basically, we're a creation of the Internet Society. I assume your audience probably knows ISOC, as they're called. But the Internet Society was founded in 1992 by some of the kind of early internet pioneers like Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn, to kind of move forward the internet as this resource and platform that ensures and enables kind of open and secure communications around the world. And so ISOC created the foundation as kind of its giving arm in 2019, and also to kind of expand the areas of work and kind of organizations with which ISOC could work. And so we take a philanthropic approach to moving forward ISOC's mission, which is that the internet is for everyone.
Cool. You have actually issued some grants exactly to that degree. I think a couple of rounds of grants now. Is that mostly around connectivity, right? Getting people connected to the internet, 250 grand here, 500 grand here. Is that a major part of the role of the work that Internet Society Foundation does?
Yeah, so as a foundation, our kind of reason for being is to give out funding, to give out grants. And so we do that in a number of different areas. And I would say those cover both connectivity, so getting people connected to the internet.
Mm-hmm.
They cover kind of ensuring that people know how to use the internet once they're connected to improve their lives in whatever way that might look like for that community. And then also looking forward at the kind of challenges and opportunities that the internet might present to us. And so we provide grants kind of within that realm. And so our grants look like things such as the Beyond the Net program that you'd mentioned in the introduction, which is a program that provides grants to the Internet Society chapters. If you're not familiar with them, I picture the Internet Society chapters as being kind of local grassroots organizations that really care about maintaining the internet as this open and secure infrastructure. And so they're very much tapped into what that looks like on the local level within their countries.
Mm-hmm.
There's chapters in 130 countries around the world, so it's very, very global. And they can apply for grants of up to $30,000. So pretty small in the grant space. And then we have that skills, that very long acronym program that you'd mentioned at the beginning as well, which focuses less on the connectivity piece and more on, so how do you use that connectivity once you have it?
Okay.
And how do you leverage it to improve your educational or economic outcomes? And then we have other programs that look into kind of how the internet works or looking forward to the challenges and, as I mentioned, opportunities it can present. And that's our research program.
Mm-hmm.
And that is much more focused on kind of collaborative research that can be applied. And we have 4 different focus areas, and I'm happy to talk about those. And then we also have a program that focuses on both disaster resiliency and disaster recovery. And given that we launched just in time for a global pandemic, the actual first, it was
Congrats.
great. I know. It was both great because I think it really put into stark contrast the importance of the internet and why our work is important, but also I've worked with people for 2 years almost at this point that I've yet to meet in person. It is what it is.
Ditto.
And so, exactly, right? So, but we can do this through the internet. And so that program around disaster, we focus mostly on response. And so we issued some larger grants up to 500K that focused on using the internet to respond to the COVID pandemic. And we've had 2 rounds of those grants so far. So we do a lot of different things to date, and we'll be moving into different areas like innovation. Like, what does innovation look like on the internet in the philanthropy space, and how can we support that moving forward?
That's terrific. This actually comes hot on the heels of the last episode of Private Podcast, which was with Benga Sasan, an individual from Nigeria who does pretty much this exact sort of work, but on the skill side, helping Nigerian young men and women learn how to use computers, learn how to tap these skills into economic opportunities. So obviously access is important, but then, like as you mentioned earlier, making sure you actually know what to do with the access and with the skills and leverage them. So that's terrific. If you haven't already met him, maybe you should.
I conveniently enough, Fun Bega's amazing. He's fantastic, and he's actually one of our grantees under the skills program. We're working with them to take that long running, it's been going on for over a decade, life program in Nigeria and move it to Senegal, which is one of our focus countries.
Yeah, you talked about that.
Yeah, so we're funding them to do that, and they're like a truly fantastic partner.
Awesome. That's great to hear. Good. So there, I had the idea and you're already ahead of me. Fantastic.
Full circle.
What led you to join the Internet Society Foundation?
Yeah, so in the kind of philanthropy space, having a foundation that is new and just starting up is mostly unheard of. It's a very rare opportunity. And to have a foundation that is focused on things that I cared about, like digital inclusion, digital rights, leveraging the internet, I don't know if this will happen again. So I saw the posting and knew that I needed to apply, and obviously did. And so that was it. So for me, it was an opportunity to build something from scratch, which I think, given that most of the podcasts I've seen to date have been about tech and kind of founders, is something I think probably a lot of your listeners are really excited about, like figuring out how to do this thing for the first time.
Yeah.
And then especially figuring out how to kind of bridge those gaps between digital inclusion, innovation, and also leveraging the kind of deep expertise and knowledge that you have at the Internet Society, our kind of like sister organization, to do those things is fantastic. And I don't think there's that space in which you have these really deep technical expertise that you can combine around the internet, that you can combine with philanthropy and kind of moving that mission forward.
So I think a little bit deeper on that, this works really well. So what are some of the maybe the biggest challenges you've come across in actually ensuring people have secure and open internet access?
I mean, I think that's the kind of $1 million question for everyone, right? Like, there are so many challenges in some ways, and then how do we figure out how to address them? And so I think the underlying piece of that question is probably the last word you used, which was internet access. And so I think the key piece is, and the fundamental one that you need before anything else, is access to the internet. And so right now, roughly half the world has internet access. So what are we doing about the other 50%, give or take, depending on how you count? And what are we doing about the people whose access is incredibly expensive? They can't, it's unstable. It's being cut off because governments are willfully cutting off their access to the internet. Or they live in zones that are prone to disasters, where if there's a hurricane, your internet's cut off. I think there's that broader question. And there's a lot of different ways to approach that. There are solutions, small and large, depending on the communities you work with, that range from things like, community-owned networks, community networks, to broader broadband solutions, to some of the smaller projects we fund are things like amplifying the Wi-Fi network around local community buildings, be that a library, which we saw a lot during COVID, or a community center, so that the community can either drive up or go to those locations and access a Wi-Fi hotspot that they wouldn't have in their own homes. So I think that's a huge piece. It's just the access and figuring that out. And also ensuring that people have devices that are able to allow them to access that internet as well. Yeah. Because not everyone has 5G enabled phones, like I assume you and I do.
Not quite. I'm still on 4G, but but I'm not complaining. Yeah.
I mean, this is why I left Canada, right?
Oh, yeah.
Um, but back to the point. So access, I think, is a big piece. And then I think if we want secure and open access to the internet, you need users that understand what that means for their actual use of the internet and why that's important. And so I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in North America, around the world, around digital literacy and digital hygiene. Like, access to the internet, the UN has declared this, is a human right, right? Because it enables all these other rights.
Yeah.
And so I think we want to ensure that users don't just see the internet as something like Facebook, which is sometimes hard in context with zero rating, but that it's something that allows them to express and fully live these other rights. And I think that's a key piece, digital literacy. And that is enabled not just by the users, but by broader policy environments, which is often a challenge. And that happens at the national level, right? Like we're having debates about encryption backdoors.
Yeah.
That really impedes a secure internet. Or in countries where there's internet shutdowns. And I think there was something like almost 200 in 2020 in the middle of a global pandemic where people couldn't leave their house. That's huge. Like we need to fix those policy frameworks. That includes at the national level having advocates who understand the issues, journalists reporting on them, policymakers who understand the issues. And this isn't just an issue of other countries. Like when Facebook was before Congress, there was the congressional representative who asked how Facebook makes money. And I think we all kind of laughed at the time because to us that's a little bit ridiculous. But
Right.
I do think a lot of people don't understand how the things that they're interacting with on the internet work. And that's hugely important. And it's important that policymakers understand. So we have policy frameworks that enable an open and secure internet.
Okay.
That was a huge answer. I'm sorry.
You know what? It's if these are not the questions are short, but they're fairly broad and a little vague, pretty much just to let you talk. So that's totally fine that you're giving long answers. This should be mostly you talking anyway. You touched on a couple times there this issue of internet access being a human right, which has been declared. And I think certainly anybody who's listening to this understands it is so fundamental to being able to do just about anything. Just like needing a phone line back in the 70s and 80s, 1970s and 80s was pretty much table stakes, right? Like you weren't going to move to a home unless it had a phone line, even if it was a party line. And I'm not going to explain what a party line is. Somebody else can go look that up.
My dad grew up in like northern Ontario and had a party line, and I'm not going to say his age in case he watches this, but he's not very old. So
it's actually still a recent phenomenon in the sense that I think the last few party lines that were eliminated in Ontario were in 2004 because I was working for the phone company that was still running them. And they finally ran fiber optic cable up the Bruce Peninsula and got everybody connected, and no more party lines. But around Lion's Head and Tobermory, like in between those two somewhat large towns, all sorts of people still had party lines in the early 2000s. So it's not that old of a phenomenon in the sense that there were still people who had these fairly recently, but certainly that was the way just about everybody had a phone line for a long time. But anyway, phone lines, I think, were absolutely necessary, especially when we started doing services like 911 and 411, right, which obviously have almost completely supplanted paper in a lot of respects, the yellow pages, etc. Internet connectivity is absolutely crucial these days. You touched a little bit on rights and making sure people have these. What was the catalyst for your interest in these topics of digital rights and digital inclusion?
it's funny. I think I was asked that when I interviewed for this position, and looking back, I think I can draw kind of like a narrative throughout my experiences that would explain it, though I'm not clear that at the time what I would have articulated that as would have been digital rights or digital inclusion. But so I grew up with a mom who had MS, so she was in a wheelchair for most of my life. And so if you grew up in a small town near Ottawa, 6 months of the year, it's really hard to leave your home if you're in a wheelchair. And so the internet for her was really, in some ways, I think a lifeline. Like it allowed her to play games online, to send emails and keep in touch with people, to do a range of things and access information that I don't think she would have been able to otherwise. And so in retrospect, I realized that I think informs a lot of my work now. The idea that different people access the internet in different ways with different abilities and for different purposes, but that everyone's approach to that is incredibly important and should be kind of respected, and we should consider that as we build out these tools. But then I also did things like in grad school, I lived in Syria for a few months, which Facebook, it was 2009, Facebook was blocked in Syria. There was a number of websites that were blocked, the social media. And so you had to use what I've since realized was a VPN when you went to the coffee shop to get on the internet and like give them a little bit, I don't know if I should talk about this publicly, like
Just don't name the cafe. Should
a
be okay.
little, God, is it still there? Like give them a little bit of extra money to get on, like so that they would enter the password to the VPN so that you could then access Facebook to tell your parents that you were doing great. Like just things like that is how I really I think I shaped my knowledge of what the internet looks like for different people, and that what it looks like for me today is definitely not what it looks like around the world. And so this tool that is clearly increasingly important is fundamental, and I think that informs a lot of my interest in this work.
Cool. What's on the horizon for the Internet Society Foundation, and what do you hope to, to achieve over the next few years, decade, etc.?
Yeah, so I think it's, given how new we are, I think for us it's nothing but horizon at this point. Like we're very new. We're in the first round of all of the grants we've given. None have closed yet. And so I think for us it's really figuring out in the shorter term, what our impact is, what are the results of these grants, what kinds of partnerships we want to make, ultimately with the goal of ensuring that the internet is for everyone and that it is something that everyone has access to, as I said, in ways that benefit them and that make sense to them, and that are accessible to them, hopefully everywhere in the world. That's just, I'm going to talk to my boss about that broad vision.
What about the other 50%? Like what sort of things do you hope to happen as we eventually connect 7.5 billion, probably almost 8 now, 8 billion people to this global community, if we can call it that?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of people working on that issue. Very, like Benga, like very smart people who know the issues, who know what it looks like within specific contexts. And so if the question is, what do I want that to look like? I mean, I think I want it to look like an open, secure, interoperable internet that everyone can use to access the information they need, in a format that like makes sense to them and that they can use, and feel secure while doing it, and really have an understanding of how they're operating in that space, and that they feel like they have some control over that, both in terms of the information they're giving out, their data, or the information that they're receiving, that they know what they're getting as well. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it does. What ways is the Internet Society Foundation addressing how the digital gender gap affects women's livelihoods, their health, their educational outcomes, things like that?
Yeah, I came across some stats recently that I think really kind of put the digital gender gap into context. So big picture, in lower to lower middle income countries, women are 80% less likely than men to own a mobile phone. That's huge. Like that's a huge
That's a big gap,
piece.
yeah.
Yeah. And 20% less likely than men to be online. So if you consider it within that context of what the world looks like, that's the scene. And so the things that we're doing as a foundation, less than 2 years in, I think we're approaching this through both a research and kind of a training and education lens. So on the research front, as I mentioned, we have a research program, conveniently named, that is working with the World Wide Web Foundation to undertake a study of that digital gender gap, and they're specifically looking at the economic costs of women not being online. So, like, what is that gap actually costing us if women don't have the resources and the skills to be on these networks? And that's a relatively new grant, so I'm really looking forward to seeing the outcomes of that. But they're leveraging data from organizations like the ITU and GSMA, as well as stakeholder surveys and interviews. So I think it's going to be a really wide-ranging report. And they're a great organization. So there's that piece. I think if we're going to address it, we need to understand it and what that
Mm-hmm.
actually looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the kind of more training and education front, our skills program, um, basically, as I mentioned, funds that kind of, once you have access, how do you use it? Gap. And so is working to create educational and training programs that do a number of different things. I'm going to pause for half a second and just make sure the connection's still working.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Um, and so that program looks at more the training piece. And so we're providing grants to organizations in different parts of the world that are running training programs in part focused on women. And this looks like we have a couple of grantees in Colombia. One is an organization called HIAS, and they work with Venezuelan migrants, specifically women, in Colombia to provide them kind of micro entrepreneurship skills so that they can leverage their current skills using the internet to get themselves online and kind of sell their products or leverage the resources they need for their business. But they're also adding in a gender component to that because women's online participation doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? Like
Right.
the internet doesn't exist in a vacuum, it exists in society. And so it helps them address the kind of societal issues there as well about being online and accessing the internet and becoming often the breadwinner in the family. To organizations in Senegal or Bangladesh who are teaching kids, including girls, basic digital literacy skills so that they can leverage that for their education. But an interesting part of that is that organizations like Teach for Bangladesh are not only teaching kids, they're also looping in their parents because there's a lot of kind of misinformation, especially when it comes to girls being online, about these hazards of the internet. And so it's important that parents realize that, yes, these things happen, but there are ways to mitigate them, and that shouldn't impede their children accessing educational opportunities. And
Right.
if you have one phone in the family, maybe your daughter should have equal access to your son. Um, or even we have a grantee in Senegal, Sinam, who's doing really great work around teaching girls, again, digital literacy skills, but also are introducing them to kind of female entrepreneurs and startup owners so that they can have a view of what you can do actually with digital skills and that there's possibilities there. Because I think in some ways, I'm going to quote RuPaul's Drag Race, and I think my colleague is really going to appreciate this. But there was one drag queen in the early season who said something like, if you can't see it, you can't be it. And I
Right.
think that's an important idea here as well, that you need kind of mentorship, that if you've only ever seen men who don't look like you in these positions, then you might not think it's for you. And that's really important as well. And so I think those so far are the ways in which we're addressing it, both understanding it and then providing different models for what that access and bridging that gap looks like.
I am perfectly okay with any quotes you want to pull from RuPaul.
Am I the first person to quote RuPaul? I hope so.
I think so. This will be like episode 53 or 4, and I'm pretty sure, yeah, you're the first. So congrats. um I think there's a little bit more to dig in on
Yeah.
there because earlier this year, the Internet Society Foundation announced $1 million in grants to researchers who are studying the future of the internet. You're talking about a lot of making sure
Mm-hmm.
young girls and young boys, but mostly young girls, have access to these devices, especially if it's the only one in the home. Teaching women digital skills, crossing over from Venezuela to Colombia, and I know Venezuela's situation is not one I envy. Are there any other projects there where those researchers are examining, or I guess are these kind of the themes that the researchers are examining in terms of the future and the sustainability of the internet, or are there other things that those folks are looking at?
So the research grants do focus on four different areas. Two were just announced last week. I don't know when this is going to air, but recently, I guess, for this purpose. Um, and the four focus areas are: one, greening the internet, which looks at both the impact of the internet on the environment, but also how the internet can be used to fight things like climate change. Because I think that's an interaction that we don't often think about,
Yeah.
is that space. Another area of focus is the internet economy. So how the internet is kind of upending our traditional modes of production. I felt like a very Marxist term that comes directly from me and not the foundation. Or how we make money, how we put things online, and trying to understand if there's new and innovative ways that can be used in the internet for that. And then our two new focus areas are a trustworthy internet. So understanding, do users trust the internet? Do they trust all aspects of the internet? Like, do they trust the underlying infrastructure, but not the platforms and the software, or vice versa? And how can we change that? And then the final area is looking at decolonizing the internet. So the internet, came about in a very specific time and place and was created by very specific people who look a certain way. And that means that as it's spread around the globe, often it has not included certain voices and has, reproduced certain inequalities and power dynamics. So how, moving forward, can we think of an internet that, moves those on the margins to the center and lifts up those voices and includes cultures that we don't normally include, or languages that are often left out, into these conversations? Like, what can an internet that is decolonized look like? And frankly, this just happened. I don't know what that looks like, but I'm really looking forward to what that is. And so in terms of the current round of grantees, those focused on those first two subject areas, so greening the internet and the internet economy, the grants are really wide and kind of look at social impacts, but include things like looking at the environmental impact of subsea cables, which not a thing I would think about, but incredibly important. Or the project that I had described earlier with the World Wide Web Foundation, in terms of understanding the cost of the digital gender gap, to looking at greening IoT around trash collection in a country like Malawi. So really wide and varied. And the real goal of these grants is not just to have kind of theoretical research that's interesting, but something that we can really apply and is multidisciplinary and includes a variety of different approaches in it.
Cool. Yeah. I hadn't really thought of undersea cables. I mean, we've been doing that for well over 100 years at this point. Like, that's literally the telegraph days, or telegram days. But yeah, I mean, I don't think we can do away with them as good as wireless technology is, but certainly if there's a way to have less impact on whales, dolphins, tuna, other undersea creatures
Especially
that
the
might
tuna.
be, especially the tuna and the codfish. My family is Portuguese. Do not mess with the codfish.
I was going to say, but there's interesting kind of separate from the foundation, this predates us, but interesting research into how normally areas around subsea cables are protected. You can't drill there, you can't do anything there, obviously, because you don't want to cut those lines.
Right.
And so consequently have sort of become these environments that actually protect undersea wildlife because they congregate there. So that's why there's a lot of starfish and other things of the sort.
That's actually kind of neat.
As a
It's almost build a new reef or a little oasis for the starfish. That's cool. Do you have any thoughts on Apple's fairly recent privacy policy and labels for apps? I know Google is now, as of like sometime last week, regardless of when this airs, fairly recently in May, they announced that they're going to introduce something similar. Q4, it'll be optional. Q1 2022, it'll be mandatory for any updates to also include this privacy label. Is this a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Does it help the Internet Society Foundation's goals? Anything like that?
So I don't know if I can speak on behalf of the foundation in regards to this,
Sure.
largely because we haven't had that conversation, so I actually don't know where we would fall on it. But I would say, like, in terms of my personal opinion, and I think probably people who like privacy online, I would say it's interesting and probably a great thing. I think a lot of internet users feel like they don't have control over the data online and don't really understand how their data is being used. And so, labels on apps about what your data is being used for, I'm not sure goes the entire way to solving that problem, but at least gives users some sense of what's happening with their data. And then giving them the option of saying, like, no, actually, I don't want to be tracked across apps,
Mm-hmm.
I think starts putting the power back in, you're in my hands if we have iPhones at this point,
Yeah.
around how we want our data to be used. And I think that's incredibly important and a good step in the right direction that I look forward to seeing. I'd seen somewhere that I think it's something like 14% of people still want it to be tracked. So I think this really shows that people like feel uncomfortable being tracked, don't want that to be happening, but haven't felt like they had any way to stop it.
Yeah. And I would hazard a guess that
Mm-hmm.
at least a few of them hit the allow anyway, or like, the affirmative of like, yeah, that's fine, probably by accident, because it took me a second to read, and I was like, oh, okay. And I almost feel like the options presented are a very, very slight capitulation on Apple's part to Facebook and the noise that they've made over the last 8 to 10 months over this issue. They
Yeah,
held
and
strong. They delayed it. They delayed the implementation by a minor revision or two, but it's not. I actually don't like the way the option and or like the prompt and the options you get to pick. I actually don't like the way they're presented. I think it could be way clearer to
mm-hmm.
the user of what each one actually is. So that in a sense feels a little bit like okay, well, we'll make this slightly obscure so that people actually need to read this, which is not necessarily a bad thing. You should read what you're agreeing to, but I have a feeling that number would be even lower if the options presented were a little more stark, I guess.
And I don't have an iPhone, so this is where I've seen the screenshots online, but I haven't actually had the opportunity to be like, no, don't track me. Um,
I have a few times now.
I was asking my partner about it. I was like, you get it. Um, and so, but I think it is a first step, right? Like, I think knowing that, like, the notifications on apps about like your data is being used here or it's being used here, but it's not personally identifiable. Great, but that's not tons of information, right? Like, you don't know
Right.
exactly what that means, and you can't really opt out of like, well, okay, I'm fine with you using my data for this purpose, but not this other purpose.
Yeah.
And I think when you talk about like performance in terms of, the privacy policies we've been seeing on websites, that's also hard to figure out. Like, what exactly does that mean? Like, if you don't really understand what those terms are. And so I think it's a first step, and I really look forward to seeing if it does gain traction and other companies pick that up too.
Yeah. It's actually been really funny to look at some apps who promote privacy as a feature, not necessarily using Anukavukian, another Canadian's term of privacy by design, but certainly, we protect your data, we don't sell it, etc. But looking at these nutrition labels for apps, you actually see, regardless of whether you agree, of what you agree to when you update the app or install it the first time, there's all sorts of information in these privacy protecting apps that they're collecting at least for their own needs. And so that's, I'm not going to name names right now, but it's been really interesting just to see like, oh yeah, this really well known a VPN company, not Orchid obviously, but another VPN company who takes this, who says they take this really seriously, and their founders in the news talking about how they take privacy seriously. You go look at the app, which I no longer have installed, and you're going through the nutrition labels, and you're like, I think you got some work to do. Like if you really want to hold yourself up to this standard that you're promoting, and that's not a bad thing. That technology implementation can certainly lag behind vision. But it's if that doesn't get resolved over time, it's going to have to be somebody should point it out as a fairly large discrepancy in what's being said publicly versus what's actually being implemented. you brought up the cookie thing. Like these are for like we want to
Hmm.
put these cookies on your browser because for performance reasons. One of the things that really bothers me there is the most websites offer like I accept all or manage your settings. And the funny thing about like hitting like manage settings or customize is that all the ones you probably don't want, they're already unchecked. And so it's literally just an extra click to be like, no, I want to, as few as possible. I know you want to put one on my device because I'm logging in and I don't have to log in every single time. Okay, cool. Major convenience factor. But all the other ones, it's like this, you either need to go through every single one or accept all. So you talked about how this is like a first step, with the nutrition
Hmm.
labels for iOS and Google Play apps. Like, what would you actually like to see next?
I mean, what I'd like to see is better, and I think all of us feel like this. Like, we don't, one, we feel like we need to opt into these services, right? Like, there's no real alternative. So,
Mm-hmm.
so if you want to go to a place where your family is posting updates and communicating with each other, you're probably going to go to Facebook. Like, that's just where that lives.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, in ideal world, I would like to see alternative options to that. Like, can we build something that looks like something maybe like Facebook or not entirely, where we can go to communicate with the people we know without having to buy into all these other things? Or where I can use a communication app that is end-to-end encrypted, but that is not now suddenly sharing information with Facebook, like WhatsApp is doing.
Yeah.
Um, so I think ideal world, I think options would be great. And right now, a lot of these are centralized around 4 or 5 companies.
Right.
And I think it's good to have the information, and I would like more of that. But right now, it still feels like, okay, but if I don't consent to this, then what?
So to that point, do you think the major tech companies, Facebook, I'm not going to do Fang because Netflix kind of still operates in their own thing as much data as they do collect, and I am a Netflix user. But Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, like do these large and even in China, Tencent, Alibaba, which also has Alipay and all these other things, do they have too much power in your opinion, at least?
I mean, I think it's an interesting question. I think most Americans do. I think that's like survey data that most Americans do feel like they have too much power and that they're kind of unchecked in a lot of ways. And I think we're seeing that play out right now through the lawsuits against most of these companies and the court battles and being brought before Congress for questions. And so I think there is a kind of reckoning that is happening around that and a real questioning of, well, is this the internet we want? Um, and I think maybe a more interesting question is, so if we do feel like they have too much power, then what do we do about it? Like,
Right.
are there alternatives? And I'm not saying like what do we do about it in the sense of like antitrust lawsuits or court
No.
cases. Like that's one approach, right? But that
Yeah.
isn't one that's available to most of us. And so maybe coming back to kind of the digital inclusion and the digital skills work is like, can we build alternatives to this that actually include the communities that we want to be a part of and include diverse voices and that are self-moderating so we don't have these oversight boards, if you will, that can only take one of every 10,000 cases or whatever the number ends up being. Like that's what I'm really interested in. It's like, so what are the alternatives and how do we think about these? And like, can that be an exciting space of creation that like as a society we can figure out, and it's not like going to be communal and there's going to be different pockets to it and we'll probably get it wrong sometimes, but like what does that look like?
On the flip side, do you feel like
Mm-hmm.
these major corporations have
There is a
any
flip
sort of,
side.
well, yeah, there is like, so
Yeah, of course.
like you and I could go build a thing, try to attract some users. So could anybody else, just about anybody else with connectivity to the internet and the skills these days. Do you feel like there are any major challenges that these fairly large corporations who have large swaths of the internet, large swaths of servers ultimately under their control, do they have any sort of challenges that they're running up against maybe in the form of potential antitrust, but anything else?
So maybe to take your question and flip it again, because that's what I do. I think I'm maybe a little bit less interested in the challenges the companies are facing than the challenges the users are facing with those companies, right? And I think that that's maybe where the more interesting question is, because we know the challenges, right? Like they're the front page of the news that Facebook and Google and Amazon are facing.
Yeah.
But they're also making record profits, and they can put that money towards, very well-paid lawsuits and court defenses. And so I think when it comes to users, to come back to, the idea of privacy or an open and secure internet, I think that's where maybe for me more interesting questions lie. Like, what are the challenges that users face? And so I think it's, as we talked about, like understanding how your data is used, understanding how these corporations work, and where your data is going, and then trying to figure out, like, is there an alternative if you wanted one? And really kind of shifting the paradigm from being consumers of these products to possibly creators, and kind of no longer feeling like tech is this like unicorn thing that you need special skills to create, and really ensuring that we can all participate in that in different ways. Um, that doesn't answer your question at all because I literally changed it. But for me, like that, I think that's the interesting thing. Like, if you
That's
had a new
totally fine.
Facebook that was coming out of Nigeria, like what if one of Benga's students creates the next Facebook? What does that look like? And by
Yeah.
next Facebook, I don't think it needs to be about money or profitability. Like we've seen what that model does. And so what if we create something where we're not trying to sell it or to bring it to IPO and make a bunch of money, but where we're really just trying to ensure that people can have speech and communication amongst each other?
Yeah. I think the only thing I get concerned about there, and you just touched on it, is potentially that happening, but then them selling out. Because not that long ago, but maybe about 10 years ago now, Orkut came out of India and was going gangbusters, like just destroying Facebook in India, and or any potential for growth that they had there, and ultimately sucking up a lot of the traffic in Southeast Asia as the network, the social network of choice. Google bought them out and immediately screwed it all up, uh, and almost immediately. They were still doing okay in India and Brazil, I think, by the end. But of course, Google wanted to build Google Plus, which,
Mm-hmm.
as anybody over 30 should remember, did not go so well, and was eventually killed off, and so was Orkut in that same, roughly the same time. So that's, I guess, the only thing that would concern me is some enterprising Chinese or Filipino or Indonesian or Sri Lankan person comes along, or Nigerian or what have you, gets a group of people together, maybe gets some investment from locally, ideally, and they do build something that does take off. But then, Baidu, Tencent, Google, Microsoft, Twitter, whomever, some other foreign corporation comes in, scoops it up, thinks that it's going to be the next big thing. For some reason, just culture differences or growth trajectory, milestones that the new owner wants to hit, um, take over as the overarching goal, as opposed to this Nigerian central thing or this Sri Lankan central thing that could take off if it happened a little bit more organically. And basically, the Americans or the Canadians or the Europeans just come in and screw it all up, which Lord knows has happened time and time again throughout history. But that would be my only concern. So I guess to that end, being the person I am, if something does like that happen, I hope it's a really decentralized thing,
Mm-hmm.
regardless of whether it's blockchain specific or a distributed ledger, or you're literally securing the network by running the app on your mobile phone or whatever. That way, there is really no ownership. I think would be the ideal. I don't know how practical that is even today, but that's yeah, that would be my only hesitation of like I do hope other solutions come into play, and even if there's solutions that or platforms that I have no interest in personally
Mm-hmm.
as a Canadian, in his late 30s, just not for me. Like TikTok, I have no interest in TikTok. I'm not installing the app. But that's not a problem. It's a new platform that other people find a lot of value in, regardless of the ownership issues and governmental issues they've had in the US. Um, but yeah, I just hope that it's something that the founders and the people who actually start to use it get to say how it grows and what features they want, as opposed to some, very profit motivated entity potentially messing it all up by buying it out and you know putting their culture on top of it instead of letting it be its own thing, which pardon me, did happen for a little while with WhatsApp. WhatsApp's like, yeah, or Facebook's like, yeah, WhatsApp, go ahead, do your thing. We
Hmm.
know we paid $18 billion for you, but you'll figure it out. And then eventually that wasn't working out to Facebook's favor. And so now there's been a fairly large culture change from what I've read at WhatsApp. And now Facebook's doing what Facebook does best, which is figure out a way to make money at it. Anyway, if you want to comment, please go right ahead. But I'll
No, I mean,
digress.
I think it is a dilemma, and we can either be kind of nihilistic about it, and I think that
It's easy
sometimes
to do.
yeah, I think it's easy because, if you just treat what exists as what will be, that's where we are. And maybe I'm just being incredibly positive and will be laughed off this platform shortly following its publication. But there must be other models, right? Like there must be a different way of thinking about this that isn't this kind of like create something, grow it, sell it to Facebook. Like there must be a different reason for doing this, and there must be different ways of approaching it. Um, Honestly, I thought parlor party
Parler.
was I mean, why would you use a French term? Stop. Um, was not gonna get into it. Was sort of, I mean, it was a dumpster fire. It is a dumpster fire, but was an interesting model of kind of creating another space for speech that like is mostly focused on awful things that are exclusionary and like racist and all of these things, but it gives you an idea of like it is very difficult to do that. I think we saw a lot of privacy issues come out,
Yeah,
but it is possible, right? And then it's that maybe that is a case study of what are the challenges there. You clearly still need to deal with Google and Apple because of their app stores. So, like, are there models outside of that? How do you ensure privacy for your users if that's something that's important? How do you grow it out? But that happened, is still happening. Um, and maybe there are lessons to be learned from that about how we do that maybe in a more positive way
yeah.
moving forward.
I was actually talking to some acquaintances of mine online in a Discord server about it was about cryptocurrencies, and they're one of these people of like, oh, I don't see the value, like I don't see the use cases beyond pumping a token price and cashing out, and just it's just a making money thing. I'm like, dude, no, like there's so many use cases. So of course, from 3.5 years into it, I'm like, here's a link, here's like 10 different links right off the top of my head of actual use cases, real applications or services running on a blockchain, primarily with their own token, but regardless, using the technology for a really good reason. And one of them, I don't remember exactly which link, but one of them was a platform where there is maybe not Parler, but certainly more, I'll call it right wing sentiment being posted, and they're like, "Ooh, I don't want to be in a place like that." I'm like, okay, but then don't use it. Like, you don't have to agree with them. I don't agree with most of the things people like that say, but at the same time, just cutting them off from the internet doesn't make it go away. It just forces them underground, or forces them to make their own platform. So, if you're a I want to change hearts and minds type of person, you don't change hearts and minds by like just ignoring it, or pushing them off the platforms that you use. So it's there's certainly the open making sure people have access and can use the internet in the ways that they need to. Um, but then of course you still get people who are like, "Ooh, I don't want to see that on the internet." And for me it's just, well, then just don't go look at it. Like, you don't have to engage with people you don't agree with, regardless of what it is you're disagreeing about.
But I also think there is no real option, like outside of the current platforms.
Right.
I think comes back to that, like
Sure, sure. Yeah, oh, yeah. This was a fairly
you
small
have,
platform. It's like maybe hundreds, thousands of users at best. Like it's not certainly not millions.
yeah, and I think for the ones that exist, like it's really hard sometimes to go onto a Facebook or a Twitter and avoid a lot of that content if you don't want to
Hmm.
see it, or really just find your community there. It's definitely possible. It happens all the time,
Sure.
probably daily. Um, but like, how do we rethink those things?
I don't have the answers.
I apparently
um,
don't either. So.
that's okay. That's not what they pay me for. Um, I want to potentially end off on this question,
Mhm.
and it's something I'm asking everybody because I think it's interesting to get insight in terms of tools and processes, not necessarily specifics, but you have your face and your name out there, so I have to imagine that at least depending on who you're talking to and the types of work you're doing online, there are things you need to do to protect your privacy online. I'm just wondering if you can give us a little bit of insight in terms of, again, not specifics, but tools, processes, just kind of where your head is at when you are trying to protect your privacy while you're working online.
Uh, so I'm probably going to add security into this because I feel like those two sort of overlap in a lot of ways.
Sure.
Um, for what I mean, so I'm not hugely online. Like, I'm not an activist. I'm not the most outspoken person on the internet. So, like, my threat model isn't that. I'm also, a white woman who's from Canada, so like, and lives in the US. So, like, that also looks a specific way, I think, in terms of the things that I'm facing online.
Yeah.
But for my work, like, I might interact with human rights defenders in very close countries or groups that advocate for things that are not accepted or illegal in the countries in which they work. And so in those instances, then what I do will change. But basically, I mean, I use things like a password manager for just basic digital hygiene. I'll use a VPN, not at home every day, but if I'm like in a hotel or on an open Wi-Fi network. Um, 2FA, like there's just very like two-factor authentication, like the very basic digital hygiene are things I will do. And then depending, often I think my biggest threats are if I travel. So depending on where I am, I will constantly be using a VPN on my phone, not just on the hotel Wi-Fi's. Using encrypted communications like PGP, that is something I only do for work because it's really hard to manage on your own if you don't have an IT person you can talk to with and troubleshoot problems with.
Yeah.
Um, those are probably the big things that I do, and then try to use like end-to-end encryption. I generally avoid SMS and use Signal for most of my life, but that could just be me. Um, but yeah, that's
Cool.
what I generally do.
Yeah. No, you know what? I think it's great to have that perspective of like, I don't do a ton of super secret privacy, oriented things online, but here's some really basic things that I think everybody should do. Everybody should have two-factor
And like ad
authentication
blocker,
and
like
sure,
Privacy
yeah.
Badger, Facebook Container, those things are like on all my browsers.
Yeah, EFF, friend of Orchid. Yeah, no, Privacy Badger is actually a great cross-platform browser extension because it not only it's something I've been running into a lot lately. It has a Chrome extension which works with Brave and I think Opera, Vivaldi, etc. But they also have a Firefox extension, and
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe Safari for any Apple users out there. I'll have to double check,
I use
but
Firefox, but works on Firefox.
so do I. Terrific. All right, Brittany, thanks so much for your time this afternoon. It was really, really appreciated, and I hope everybody listening learned a lot.
Hopefully. And thank you very much.
All right, stay free, everyone.